Hi, it's Lynn Liaz, and we are going to talk about a subject that has been a hot topic for many years now, and that is the Shroud of Turin. There's a lot of skeptics and a lot of believers. I've got with me tonight Barry Schwartz, and he was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or known as STURP, the team that conducted the first in-depth scientific examination of the shroud back in 1978. Today, Barry plays an influential role in shroud research and education as the editor and founder of the internationally recognized Shroud of Turin website, that is www.shroud.com. The oldest, largest, and most extensive shroud resource on the internet, with more than 15 million visitors from over 160 countries. In 2009, Barry founded the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, known as STERA Incorporated. It's a nonprofit corporation to which he donated the website and his extensive shroud photographic collection, as well as many other important shroud resources in order to preserve and maintain these materials and make them available for future research and study. He currently serves as the president of STERA Incorporated. So we're going to have an interesting conversation tonight. I'm going to ask Barry many of the most common questions that many people out there have. Now, we hope that the information given is going to answer a lot of your questions and prove to you the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. So, Barry, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I appreciate you coming on my show.
Thank you, Lynn. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm glad to be here with you.
Well, I am happy to have you. And this is a subject that I have for a long time wanted to share with my listeners because it is so interesting. You know, the information about the Shroud of Turin and whether or not it is authentic. And there's a lot of people out there who think that it is not authentic, and there are skeptics, and there are people who believe that it is. So I would love if you would share with my listeners a little bit about your findings and the excitement that goes along with this and information about the Shroud of Turin that you have found.
Okay, well, let me begin first by explaining to everyone that when I was first approached to be on the team, that the STURP team, Shroud of Turin Research Project team, that was destined to investigate and examine the shroud, because I'm Jewish, I felt very uncomfortable getting involved in what I perceived to be a Christian project, so I originally said no. But the properties of the image, particularly one property of the image, is so unique and unlike any other image I've ever seen. And remember, I'm a professional photographer, I've looked at a lot of images, but that one property of the image sort of hooked me. And although I was still skeptical and expected to go to Turin and find the paint and the brushstrokes and come home and be done with it, it's almost 40 years later. There was no paint, there were no brushstrokes, and ultimately I did stay on the team. And it took another 20 years after we examined the shroud, the only time the shroud has been allowed to be examined in depth by scientists. But after that, it took another 20 years. But because I had access to all the data that our team had collected, because I had a massive collection of the photographs, I was the official documenting photographer for the team. So I documented the event, and because of those photographs, of course, I stayed active in making them available. But because of all that, I was still totally skeptical, and it took almost 20 years of dealing with the collective data before the evidence was so overwhelming that there was only one conclusion left, and that is this has to be exactly what it's purported to be. And of course, there are many skeptics, many of them Christians, interestingly enough. And so I find myself at times lecturing at different Christian denominations and having to sort of show people why whatever misconceptions they might have about the shroud are actually incorrect, and that the evidence is very, very powerful. I would say 97% of all the data that's been collected and studied about the shroud points towards its authenticity. So I was hesitant at the beginning, as I said. Actually, about 2 months into the project, I almost quit. But I mentioned it to one of our newer team members at the time. His name was Don Lin. He was head of imaging on the Voyager, Viking, Mariner, and Galileo projects at the Jet Propulsion Lab for NASA. So here he was, this NASA imaging scientist, my hero on the team, Catholic, and one day I said to him, "Gee, Don, what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing on this team?" And he looked at me and said, "Apparently you've forgotten that the man in question was a Jew." And I said, "No, I knew that. I didn't know a lot about Jesus. I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, but I knew he was a Jew." And then Don said, "So you don't think God would want one of his chosen people on our team?" And then I laughed and I said, no, I never thought that. And he gave me some great advice. He said, "Listen, Barry, go to Turin, stop complaining, go to Turin, do the best work you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know." And on those words, I stayed on the team. And of course, 20 years later, after the evidence convinced me, I came to realize and had been offended at times by media reports on what our team did or on even about the shroud itself. And I felt that there was a need for the public to have access to this information that I was so privileged to have in my hands. And so I built Shroud.com in January of 1996. We just celebrated our 21st anniversary online and created a website free of any advertising, paid for it all myself, so that I could share this material with everybody who was interested in it. And we're getting around 1 million visitors a year now. So I would say that for a guy who started off a total skeptic who had no interest in it or no emotional attachment, I now find that the work that I do on the shroud from now until the end of my time is really what I'll be known for and remembered for, and the most important work that I've done in my life.
So I can only imagine that something of that nature, of course, was extremely exciting. I mean, how did it make you feel to be like the number one involved person and taking the first real photos of it and everything like that?
Well, actually, the first photographs of the shroud were made in 1898 by a gentleman named Secundo Pia with a monstrous big camera and big glass plates and fluctuating lighting in the Royal Palace of Turin where he photographed it. But that ushered in the era of science and the shroud, because once photos became available, it became much wider known. Before those first photographs, the shroud was only known in northern Italy, perhaps in eastern France, and perhaps in Switzerland. But outside of the northern Italian area, not many people knew about the shroud. So that first photograph, although the quality technically was limited by the technology of 1898, still provided, I think, an opening for the scientific era. And I think most people who study the shroud view those first photographs as the ushering in of the scientific era of shroud research.
The testing that was done on the shroud,
Sure.
there was some skepticism about that. Apparently, it was alleged that there was a patch or repair that had been done to the piece that was tested, and so that the test, of course, would then not be accurate. What are your
Sure.
feelings and your research about that?
Sure. What you're referring to is the small piece that was removed from the shroud in 1988, 10 years after our team examined the shroud. And that little piece was cut out and was radiocarbon dated, and they came back with a medieval date. Now, you used the word patch, and when the researchers who found that corner of the shroud had been repaired, they used the term patch, which I think is a little confusing because on the shroud were about 30 patches that had been sewn in 1534 to repair damage done by a fire that the shroud was damaged in. And so the term patch is sort of confusing because that corner was not a piece was sewn onto it, but it was actually rewoven. The original weaving of the linen was rewoven, and interwoven with that was additional material that was cotton and, of course, much newer. And so when they dated that corner, they were not dating the cloth of the shroud as much as they were dating an area that had been repaired using a technique that was perfected in France called French invisible reweaving, designed for tapestries that were imaged on both sides so that it was virtually undetectable to the naked eye. In fact, the chemistry of that corner has now detected that once they repaired it and they sewed in the new material, the color of the new material did not match the old, so they applied a dye. And we have characterized that chemically. We know exactly what dye. It's rose madder from the madder root plant, a common dye used in medieval times, and that was applied to the area that had been repaired to match the color of the rest of the shroud. If you were to look at a photograph of the shroud today in that corner, you would, or at least the photos I made in '78, you would see that that area that had been repaired was a different color than the rest of the shroud. So when they took that piece for radiocarbon dating, in effect, they were dating a repair that was probably done in the 16th century, which would have skewed the date dramatically from 1st century to about 13th century. And so I've always chastised my friend Joe Marino for using the word patch when in fact it was a reweave or a repair would be much more accurate.
Well, so have they retested since then on areas that were not touched up or fixed? Are they going to retest it?
Well,
what's the situation with that?
Good question. No, they have not done any further testing. They have not permitted any further testing. And I mean, think about this. Every time you do a radiocarbon dating test, you are actually cutting a piece off and burning it and carbonizing it and measuring the gases that come off the completely destroyed sample. So the folks in Turin, the authorities who control or in charge of the shroud, certainly don't want chunks of it cut off to do multiple tests. The sadness about the 1988 radiocarbon dating is that they only took one sample from one corner, first cut it in half and put one half aside, then took the other half, cut it in thirds, and gave it to the 3 carbon dating labs. So basically, all the 3 labs tested the same sample, and in real science, when you have something as big as the shroud, it's 14.5 feet long by 3.5 feet wide, to test only one little corner and then draw a conclusion about the entire shroud is just bad science. And so, but no other testing has been permitted. Only one little piece was tested, and based on that one test, they claimed a 95% certainty that the shroud was not old enough to be the burial shroud of Jesus. Well, it would have been okay if they had put it in the terms I just used, but instead they just said shroud is a fake. Those were the newspaper headlines, and after those results came out in 1988, for the next 12 years, the world of the shroud was just sort of dumbfounded and trying to figure out why such an erroneous date was achieved by the carbon dating results. You have to remember that there's plenty of historical evidence showing that the shroud existed well before the earliest date given by the carbon dating labs. They have no way to explain that. They have no way to explain how the image formed on the cloth. They have no way to explain the bloodstains on the cloth that are forensically accurate. So to use one test out of all the testing that's been done, you know, in the real world, if a scientist does 100 tests and 1 or 2 point in one direction and 98 point the other way, they discard those 1 or 2 and call them outliers. In the case of the shroud, they kept the outliers and discarded all the other data that says the shroud's authentic. So I was very offended by that because I knew better. I knew about some of the historical evidence that shows this cloth was around way before the earliest date they gave. So it was very frustrating, and it took 12 years until Joe Marino and Sue Benford presented a paper at a conference in 2000 that said, look, the carbon dating got it right. The piece they tested out exactly as they described it. The problem was the choice of a sample. They chose a sample from an area that had been repaired. Well, that was breathtaking because it was a simple, you didn't need to be a physicist to understand that. And all the other, for those 12 years, everybody was trying to come up with some reason why radiocarbon dating was wrong. Well, radiocarbon dating generally is pretty accurate. And everybody knows that. Any scientist will tell you that. So there had to be another explanation, and it took 2 non-scientists, Joe Marino, a former Catholic priest, and ultimately his wife, Sue Benford, for them to come up with an answer that really solved the problem, solved the mystery. Why did the carbon dating come out as erroneous it was? Because there's now peer-reviewed science that proves that the sample they chose was inappropriate and did not represent the main body of the shroud cloth. So we owe a great debt of gratitude to Joe Marino and Sue Benford for their work. And then I hooked them up with Ray Rogers, the head lead chemist on our team, who considered them the lunatic fringe, as he called them. And he said, these aren't even scientists. Why are you publishing their work? Because I published their paper on Shroud.com. And he said, I'm going to prove them wrong. And he said, I still have some materials in my safe. And he said, I'll call you back in 5 minutes. About an hour and a half later, Ray Rogers called me back, much more sedate and quiet. He says, I don't believe it, but I think they're right. He had found the dye that had been applied, the rose madder dye, in a gum arabic base. He found cotton interwoven with splices in between that is nowhere else found anywhere else on the shroud, and there's no cotton elsewhere on the shroud. If you go back and look at Jewish law, anybody of high stature, and this is right out of the Old Testament, anyone of high stature must be buried in pure linen raiments. No mixing of the kind, something that many of my Christian brothers and sisters are familiar with. That means there couldn't be any wool or cotton interwoven with the linen, yet we find cotton interwoven in that little one corner. Why? Because cotton is very easy to dye, and linen is much more difficult to dye. And I think many ladies who are listening who have ever dyed any clothing will know that cotton's easy, you just do it. Where with linen, you have to use chemicals to prepare the linen to accept the dye. It's called a mordant. So what we have is an area of the cloth that had been manipulated so well that it fooled the eyes of the people who chose the sample. And from a scientific standpoint, I've heard from many scientists that using only one sample is not good science, that you need to have at least one other place on the shroud. A piece should have been taken from another corner somewhere else just to have a point of comparison. They never did that. So they're basing all this on a single sample taken from one little corner.
Amazing. And I agree with you. They should have, taken it from another part of the shroud. Now, for those of you listening, Barry's website is www.shroud.com. That is the internationally recognized Shroud of Turin website, the oldest, largest, and most extensive shroud resource on the internet. Now, Barry, it's a couple more questions
Sure.
I have, and they're frequently asked questions. In fact, I saw a couple of them on your website, and I've heard people ask, myself.
Sure.
The Bible says that Jesus was wrapped in cloths, plural.
Correct.
So the shroud being only one piece of cloth, how do you explain that aspect of it being one piece of cloth, but Jesus was buried in cloths, plural?
Sure. It's real simple. When Jesus died on the cross and was removed from the cross, as we still do to this day, they put a small cloth over his face, a head cloth or a face cloth, sometimes referred to as a napkin, that was a much smaller piece of cloth. It was wrapped around his head. It contained blood and probably pleural fluids from his lungs because he was in great distress physically. And that piece of cloth would have been removed once he arrived at the tomb. They would have removed that cloth, and Jewish law says if it's got blood on it, it must be buried with the body. And so that would have been set aside, and then his body prepared and wrapped in the burial shroud, which of course is what we call the Shroud of Turin. So the fact that there are two cloths is absolutely consistent with both the Gospels and what was done to Jesus, and very consistent with the first century Jewish burial. Also mentioned in the Gospel are linen strips. And why were they mentioned? Well, if you bind a body into a cloth the way the shroud is, and you don't actually wrap some strips around the body and cloth to bind the body within the cloth, when you move the body, the cloth's just going to fall off. So were visible there in the empty tomb, along with both cloths. And ironically, the second cloth has also survived. It is in Oviedo, Spain. It is called the Sudarium of Oviedo. I've actually been to Spain, and they've shown it to me. It does contain blood and fluid stains, and ironically, some of the blood stains on the Sudarium are matching the blood stains on the shroud. Same shape and size, consistent with the same set of wounds. So I believe that for my Christian brothers and sisters who read that in the Gospels and think that disqualifies the shroud, actually it doesn't disqualify it at all. It's even more accurate and more consistent, because that would be a typical first century Jewish burial of someone of high stature. And we know that the cloth was provided by Joseph of Arimathea. It says so in the Gospels. Joseph was a wealthy man. They don't tell us much else about him, but we know that. This would have been an expensive piece of cloth in the first century, probably came in from Syria on the back of a camel in a caravan, because they didn't make these fine herringbone woven cloths in Jerusalem area, but just up a ways in Syria they did. Now, by today's standards, Syria is right next door, but in the first century it would have been a long camel ride. Because we didn't have, fancy roads and fast means of transportation. So it would have been imported and consequently more expensive to begin with, and of a higher quality than was typically used for your average burial, but very consistent with what Jewish law requires.
So why is the shroud not exhibited more frequently than it has been?
So you're asking a Jewish guy to answer something that the Catholic Church controls.
Yeah, of course.
I'm smiling. Look, one of the problems is this, especially in this day and age, there's always fear of somebody coming to harm the cloth or damage the cloth. When the shroud was publicly displayed in 2015, the security was the highest it's ever been. I've been there 5 different times to see it, starting in 1978. And the security was the highest. They had drones flying around. They had cameras everywhere. They had armed military people with big guns walking around. And, they had a very secure queue to get into the cathedral. So their big concern is potential harm to the cloth, but just bringing it out of its protective case and putting it on public display exposes it to the air of Turin, exposes it to light, all of which could be harmful to the cloth. And, of course, when several million people show up over a few weeks in Turin, the logistics of that is expensive. They have to have thousands of volunteers, traffic control, queue control, security. So the cost to put it on public display is very high. And so they do it, historically, was about 4 times a century, every 25 years or so. In more recent years, the popes, who are now the legal owner, the living pope is now the legal owner of the shroud, so he can decide to show it anytime he wants. And both Benedict and Francis have actually had public showings before this next scheduled one, which is in 2025 and marks Holy Year of the Catholic Church. So I think that to answer your question, that logistically it's a very difficult thing to put it on display, and it's in part to preserve and protect the cloth, and in part because of the logistical problems that are created by several million people coming to Turin, which is a nice-sized city, but that's a lot of people to show up, and that's historically what they get every time it's on public display.
Well, another question I had, and it seems kind of silly, but it is a question that a lot of people seem to have, is about the length of the hair. There's a scripture reference in Corinthians.
Yes.
In fact, it's 1 Corinthians 11, 14, and 15,
it is,
where it indicates, the nature itself teaches us that it's a shame for a man to have long hair, yet the image on the shroud is shoulder length to longer hair. So could you give the listeners maybe some of your insight on that, about the length of hair worn during that time?
That is one of the most common reasons why some Christians are shroud skeptics, because of that 1 Corinthians passage. So I have to point out to people, okay, that's exactly what it says in the New Testament. When was that written? About 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion. That was a rule that wasn't written at the time of Jesus, so it didn't apply to him. Jesus followed the rules of the Old Testament, the laws of Moses, which required Jewish men to have long hair and beards. And to this day, if you go to a Hasidic or Orthodox Jewish community, you'll see all the adult males have long hair and beards. That was required. So Jesus followed the Old Testament laws. The New laws hadn't been written at the time of his death. So I understand why people, bring that up, but it didn't apply to Jesus.
Interesting. I kind of found that out looking through your website, and I found some very interesting questions, like I said, that I've heard people ask before. So I definitely wanted to bring them up to my listeners.
Well, I'm glad you did.
Yeah, because I believe the shroud is authentic personally. So
Sure.
I want my listeners to hear why they should also consider the shroud as being authentic for those of them who do not. Now, I'm sure that you encounter a lot of opposition from people about this. Oh, yeah.
Sure, regularly. And by the way, as far as that issue that we just discussed, it's such a common issue that Houston Baptist University approached me to write an article, and I decided to write one called 5 Reasons Why Some Christians Are Shroud Skeptics. So if you go to shroud.com and just type 5 reasons into our search engine, it'll pop it right up and you can read it. And I address the 5 most common reasons that Christians have told me personally are the reasons why they reject the shroud. And I strongly urge anybody who feels that way to at least take the time to read. It's about 8 or 9 pages, so it's not a real long article, and it's not steeped in scientific jargon because I'm an old hippie photographer, not a scientist. So I write for the average person rather than for the science-minded. So I think if you read that, if you have those feelings, at least take a look at those 5 reasons, because I believe that will answer most of the critical questions that Christians have when it comes to the shroud. And I wrote it only to explain that misinterpreting the Gospels, for example, the reason we just discussed, hey, that was written 20 years after Jesus. So it didn't apply to him. Anything after that, certainly it would apply to. And, to this day, even though I happen to have long hair like the man of the shroud, but even to this day, there are many people who look down upon long hair on men. And I understand that. But at the same time, that particular one and many of these other facets really didn't apply to Jesus.
Interesting. I'm glad you explained that for everybody. And how do they find that on your website again, those 5 questions?
Yeah, it's called the 5 Reasons Why Some Christians Are Shroud Skeptics. And we have an internal search engine on the front page of the site and on our library page. So it searches only within our website because it's so massive I could no longer find what I'd put there myself. And so by using that, just type 5 reasons, and that'll be enough, and hit the button, and it'll give you a list of things, and the first one should be that particular article, which, as I say, for anybody who has these doubts, my hope was to at least give them some answers to these questions that are valid questions, and hopefully answer that so that they'll understand that the shroud doesn't violate anything in the Old or New Testament.
Yeah, I see some of them here, some of the concerns, like number 1, you have the shroud as a graven image.
Right.
And then you've got the shroud as just another Catholic relic.
Yeah.
Number 3, the Gospels state that Jesus was tied with linen strips.
Right.
Number 4, the man of the shroud has long hair, which is forbidden in the Gospels. And finally, number 5, the prophecies say the man's beard was plucked. So for those of you listening, those are 5 questions that Barry addresses, and you can find that on his website. But he also has a list of frequently asked questions available on his website as well. Now, one more thing I wanted to ask you about, because the shroud is the most intensely studied artifact in human history in terms of the amount of hours that has been spent on research. And the majority of evidence points toward authenticity. However, many people tend to discount that because they don't want to encounter something that might upset their own beliefs. And I'm sure there's many other reasons. So
sure, but that's a good one. That's a very common one. I've heard that. This is, think about this. If you're an atheist and now all of a sudden we have evidence that everything it says in the Gospels that was done to Jesus is now supported forensically by the Shroud of Turin, well, that can be very challenging to somebody who's either an atheist or someone who really wants to reject all this. So, they have to deny it. And I hate to say it, but, that's not unusual. People will often deny evidence that doesn't go in favor of their particular belief system. So I understand that. And look, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I had a gentleman come up to me after one of my lectures up in Vancouver, Canada, and he said, "Oh, it's a great lecture." He said, "Mr. Schwartz," he said, "but you'll never convince me." And I looked him right in the face and I said, "Excuse me, but what makes you think I even care what you believe? That's between you and God. Take it up with him." Because
I like that answer. That's so true.
Yeah, it's like, who am I to tell somebody what to believe? So it's not my place to tell people what to believe. I can talk about a piece of cloth and the evidence and even what it means to me and what impact it's had on my life. But I can't say that anybody else should feel the way I do. That's why we put Shroud.com up there with all the data. So anybody who really wants to examine this up close and personal, you can go there, you can study it. I'll tell you what, pack a lunch. The reason I had to put the search engine there is it's gotten so huge after 21 years, I can't find anything without that search engine. So you can use that, and I believe that the evidence is strong enough, not so much to change anybody's mind, but to open their minds to the possibility that this is the real thing.
Well, one more quick question before we go, because we're about out of time.
Sure.
I've read many articles about how the image, I don't know the right word to use, seemed to be almost burned into it somehow. And a lot of Christian people feel like that was the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God. What can you say about that, or what can you share with the listeners about how this image seemed to have been burned into the cloth?
Well, one of the possibilities that we examined, because it was a theory proposed by a very well-known shroud skeptic whose name I won't mention, but one of his theories was that, they made the shroud by taking a metal statue, a sculpture, if you will, heating it up and laying the shroud on it to scorch the image onto the shroud. Well, since that was a very popular theory circa 1978, we took with us a series of tests that basically it's called ultraviolet fluorescence photography. And basically what we did was we hit the shroud with ultraviolet, very narrow band ultraviolet light, and photographed it through filters that only allowed the fluorescence of the cloth and the image to hit the film. Well, that fluorescence ultimately proved that the image of the shroud was not a product of high temperature, because remember, the shroud was in a fire in 1532. There are documented scorches and burns running up both sides of the cloth. Every scorch on the shroud that's a product from the high temperature event fluoresced in the red as expected. The image on the shroud not only didn't fluoresce, it actually blocked or quenched the fluorescence of the background of the cloth, which is kind of a pale yellow-green fluorescence that the cloth gives itself. The scorches were all fluorescing in the red, the background in the pale green. The image not only didn't fluoresce, like I say, it blocked the fluorescence of the background. The image on the shroud is not the product of a high-temperature event.
Well, I am very happy that you explained that, too, because that's one interesting thing that I've heard about that I was always interested in, was about this image being burned into it. And I think
if it wasn't by heat, and some people say, okay, perhaps it was an intense light, and of course light is mentioned both in the Old and New Testaments, really. So perhaps some form of light, but it isn't any form of white light that we know today, because we know the properties of visible light. And the shroud image, although it is somewhat photographic in nature in that it has its lights and darks reversed like a photonegative, but that's the only property that it has like a photograph. It's got three-dimensional information encoded into it that we cannot do with photography or artwork. So that was that one property that hooked me at the very beginning of all this 40 years ago, and still remains a mystery to this day. The answer to how the image was formed, that was the question our team went to answer. We spent 5 days and nights at the shroud, day and night, around the clock, and then 3 years evaluating and reducing our data and publishing it into peer-reviewed journals. And the answer to the one question we went to ask could not be given. We don't know a mechanism that can create an image with the same chemical and physical properties of the Shroud of Turin, and every effort to do so in modern times has not even come close.
Well, for me as a Christian, in my opinion, I think that it could have been something supernatural pertaining to the Spirit of God.
Sure, and couldn't rule that out, but that's where science stops and faith begins. And I always tell people, because they always say, well, what does this mean to our faith? And I go, well, I hope your faith isn't reliant on a piece of cloth. That if your faith, if your faith is so weak that you need something like this to support it, then you've got a problem. Go re-examine your faith, because the answer to faith isn't going to be on a piece of cloth, but in the eyes and hearts of those who look upon it.
Oh, amen, and I agree with you on that. But for those who don't know the Lord and don't believe in God, this piece of material could be very important. But I do want to say to you as we close out here, and I want to remind the listeners, you can go to Barry's website at www.shroud.com and check out his information. There's nothing that he is selling. This isn't a promotion for an item or anything.
That's correct.
We just want you to check out this information and have the correct information, because there are a lot of rumors and misinformation and skepticism on this matter. In fact, I used to believe the shroud was fake until I came across an article about Joe Marino's work. And Barry just mentioned him a while ago. And that is what really caused me to look deeper. And there was a lot of information I found out that I had been wrong on. And Joe came across an old video of mine stating that I thought the shroud was fake. And that's how I became friends with Joe. And then Joe hooked me up with Barry. So very interesting. Be sure and check it out. www.shroud.com. And Barry, before we close out here, do you have anything else that you feel is important, just real quick, that you would like to share with the listeners?
The only thing I would say is this, that if you have any inclination to think that this might be some kind of fake or forgery, take a little time, go to shroud.com. We're not selling stuff. There are no ads. So there's no flashing, stuff in your face. Take some time, ask the questions, look at the questions that are already answered and look at the ones that remain unanswered, and then look in your own heart and ask who would create something that defies 21st century imaging science, the most image-oriented era of human history, and we still don't know a mechanism that can make an image like this.
Yeah, and for those of you listening, the website is extremely extensive, and if you're really into the shroud and you find it interesting, you could spend many, many days on his website because he has put so much time into this. So be sure and check it out. And Barry, I want to thank you again for agreeing to be on my show. And I can't wait to share this information with my subscribers on YouTube and anybody else who happens upon this video. Thank you again for your time. I know that you're a busy man and your time is valuable. So I just want you to know how much I appreciate it, and my subscribers appreciate it as well.
Truly my pleasure. And thank you so much, Lynn, for having me on and giving me this time.